I know that burnout is um, a topic that's not new to any of us. I'm sure you've heard by now the question, if you check your cell phone on a regular basis to make sure the battery is in fact charged, do you do the same thing about your own personal battery? Are you attending to the needs of renewal and at not only ourselves personally, but also the people whom we may have some responsibilities for, or the people with whom we're working with? Are we helping create a space in which they, in fact, can check their batteries and charge their batteries as they go about doing their work? Now, I want to take a few minutes to go what I call behind the curtain. And there are a couple of things about behind the curtain that I believe are important to make note of. And when I say behind the curtain, I mean some assumptions that I carry around in terms of paying attention to creating materials and training other folks and doing things to help facilitate growth. I have in mind these points, and I just want to touch bases on a couple of them, and I'll do a deeper dive into Kagan's material here in a minute, especially as it relates to burnout issues. Bob Kagan out of Harvard did a spectacular job of taking a look at how human beings manage the demands that they face and the ways in which they make sense of their experience. And I'm going to call these meaning-making frames. He thought of them as levels of development, and we'll look at that in more detail in just a second. His book in 1994, In Over Our Heads, really was the first foray that the demands of modern life are so extraordinary and so demanding that there are lots of us who are in over our heads and likely to experience high levels of stress and burnout over time. We all know that in the talent management world, the whole notion of 75-25, meaning 75 is broken into 70-20-10 in terms of experience, relationships, and what I'll call formal learning, like books and workshops and seminars and things of that nature. And the 25 relates to hardships, and hardships can come in any number of forms. And I would venture to say that for many people, their hardships are out of work experiences. In other words, it's not the hardship at the office, it's the hardship at home, which can be a source of such enormous consumption of personal resources. And it is, in fact, how our out of work experiences help us develop resilience and coping strategies that is so very important. So we know, and you'll see it threaded in the materials that we share, that in fact we can help people have the kinds of experiences that will help them manage their renewal and restoration needs. The GRASP frame is a frame that comes, it's my shorthand way of talking about all of the neurological studies on learning, and actually the behavioral studies on learning, which pretty much say when we're trying to do something, we're trying to gather a new behavior or modify behavior. It takes time, it's gradual, it takes lots of repetition, it takes some form of reinforcement. There has to be degrees of active engagement with the behavior we're trying to shift or change. And we have to be very attentive to the internal and external ways in which we control stimulus, and I'll say more about that in a minute, as well as practice in a situation where we can get feedback to improve on the behavior that we're trying to enhance. The stimulus control piece is kind of interesting because it has to do with our internal as well as our external environment. And by external environment, I mean actually the ways in which we set up our external environment to encourage us to do things like mindful practices, for example, as well as our internal environment and what we do to bring more self-control to an array of internal distractions, which could easily occur. Brain science has pretty much made it clear that if we are going to maximize well-being and reduce burnout and reduce the stresses in our life, there are a number of more mindful things we need to do, and we'll talk about that in detail, to be effective. You will find throughout all of our materials, we've built a high level of focus on self-management and mindfulness, because it's our view that these kinds of practices will become increasingly important in such a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. Now, I want to pause a little bit with Kagan's stuff just to level set so that you all know when I referred to Bob Kagan's stuff. Bob Kagan identified as adults that there are various levels. He called one level, level 2, rule referent, meaning that individuals make sense of things by virtue of standard operating procedures or rules that have been put in front of them. Typically, there's a lot of binary thinking here and very concrete thinking about how we are to do things. And what happens for these individuals who are operating at this level is that they begin to get burnt out in their work when there's increasing ambiguity, when they are being expected to see and engage in dealing with long-term strategy and complex challenges that haven't been broken down into smaller definable units for them. So these individuals who tend to prefer routine can start becoming burnt out in their work and in their work lives when that routine is beginning to disappear and they're expected to be more fluid in the tasks that they have to do. The vast majority of people operate in what Kagan referred to as the other referent, meaning that individuals make sense of their work and they make sense of their day and they make sense of their tasks by how they see themselves in relation to other people. The affiliative importance of gauging oneself in relation to other people has to do with the sense of belonging. And when they feel they're doing those things that are expected and those things that are accepted, they feel as though they are belonging and in the right place. They begin to experience burnout when there's unclear status in the groups that they're in, or the sense of belonging begins to be shaken by lots and lots of changes and adjustments and a lack of clarity about the roles that they have and the groups that they have. And it seems difficult to establish collaborative relationships. And so these folks will begin to be very distracted by the sense that they don't know who they're working with or why. Level 4 or self-referent thinkers are those who do believe that you can test ideas. They run all kinds of little experiments to check out what's possible. They make sense of things by making sure there's expertise behind what they're doing, by making sure there's rigorous analysis, and that they choose based on having thought through the evidence and thought through the goals and typically a longer term perspective. They are individuals who have a sense in which they are themselves becoming an authority on the work or the roles that are required. And they begin to experience burnout when it is not clear to them what the meaning of the work is and how the work contributes to the overall enterprise. If you think back with the earlier group, it was about the standard operating procedures, meaning making related to getting things done according to the specified plan. For these folks, they begin to lose their sense of meaning when they can't see that the work is connected to longer term goals and overall enterprise responsibilities. And of course, the fifth level, the systems referent folk, are those who tend to be very pluralistic and relativistic in their approach to things. They tend to have a long-term horizon, and yes, they like to test things out. They like to find paradoxes and ironies in all kinds of circumstances. They look for feedback loops, and for them, where it gets to be a source of burnout in their day-to-day work life is when they find that they are unable to communicate the complexity of the systems around them, or communicate what the vision is for the long term for people to understand it and seek it, and who become impatient. So for them, when they're in this space and they're trying to explain why it is things aren't simple, and why it is we need to look at multiple timelines, for people to push back against that and not feel as though that they're being understood, it becomes very problematic. So the last sort of behind the scene thing that I want to say is that both Bob and I have spent a long time taking a look at the brain research that's been around for many, many years, and it's been intensified because of technology. There's some things we know about the brain. We know the brain is energy efficient and energy hungry, really, that we're all programmed to find comfort and avoid pain and look for an efficient path for both. That the vast majority of the way people do things is built into what we might think of as automaticity. And while that automaticity enables us to be efficient, we also have a countervailing energy around curiosity, around new and different. We come to that curiosity through conscious awareness and conscious operations, and what we need to be mindful of is that that consciousness, or that attentive focus, is an island that is in the sea or ocean of unconscious programs that are running the show or running the story. And what we know about burnout in the brain is that when sleep is inadequate, when attention to restorative activities are not effective, and when the demands increasingly grow, individuals have burnout, and that burnout has with it lots of very bad outcomes in terms of health and mental well-being. Over the last couple of years, there have been a variety of large professional groups who've been asking the question, are people experiencing burnout? And what we can see from this one study that's reported, that in fact 57% of folks surveyed in the UK reported burnout, 50% in the United States. We know that in most recent days, especially during COVID-19, APA and other professional organizations are reporting that there is a dramatic increase in the number of stress levels and mental health related issues that have occurred because of elevated demands for people to produce while they're working at home, but producing in an environment of increasing uncertainty and ambiguity, and the loss of connection to those people with whom they work. Employees are beginning to report their work at home environment has led to less sense of appreciation and not being recognized for what it is they're contributing. And of course, we know if they have families, the stress is increased because of dealing with things that are going on at home. In Australia, HR study that was published, and I chose Australia in part because when we often think of Australia and the way Australians think of themselves, they think of themselves as productive and people who enjoy a good time and enjoy the fruits of their labor, but don't have some of what we often think of in at least North America, the demands and pressures that we have created for ourselves. But even there, the report of a significant amount of loss and or sabotage because people feel burnt out and stressed is significant, even in a country where we can measure things in some ways more precisely than we can in other parts of the world. Studies here in North America have shown that even though professionals feel pretty passionate about their work, they also feel they're overly stressed and frustrated in the work that they're doing. And numbers of them, roughly 77%, have reported that they experience burnout, and that in fact they are, while passionate about their work, the burnout they're experiencing is coming for a variety of reasons. So, for example, in the continuation of the Deloitte study, the Deloitte study of 7,500 employees found that, in fact, while folks were surveyed, they felt that there was an unmanageable amount of stress and frustration in their work. 87% felt that while they're passionate about their work, they're frequently quite stressed out about what's expected of them to do and to perform. Often, 70% of the folks feel that organizations aren't doing what could be done to help deal with it. And of course, we'll talk about what can we do to help with the workplace culture that impacts burnout. And an interesting piece on millennials, with a large number of them reporting that they are experiencing burnout in their current job. Now, in the ongoing study of an additional study, a Gallup survey found that the main reasons for burnout were the sense of unfair treatment, the feeling that the workload was unmanageable, that their role was not clear, that communication or support wasn't there, or the time pressures were quite unreasonable in what was expected of them in order to produce. So we know that when these particular things are present, the trouble has started. If individuals, or even if you begin to feel cynical or hypocritical, if you are feeling or observe other people are dragging themselves into work and having trouble getting started, if people seem to be more impatient or irritable with themselves, with coworkers, with others, if there's energy that seems to be inconsistent, a lack of satisfaction and a lack of concentration, or people reporting disillusionment, certainly the increase in the use of any sort of mind-altering chemical like alcohol or drugs is an indication of increased stress and burnout. And when people are experiencing sleep habit changes, the levels of stress are clearly quite high. Now, when you go look for what are people doing to deal with their burnout or deal with their particular levels of stress, you typically find these strategies, and all of these are good ones. There's nothing wrong here with these particular strategies. Evaluating options, seeking support, obviously making sure there's time to relax, and making sure we're exercising and getting sleep. All of those are important. And from a talent management perspective, we would suggest to you, as you'll see here in a minute, there's some things we can do to accentuate these kinds of behaviors, which we know are important. Now, mindfulness first came about in terms of people writing about it and thinking about it. It was seen as woo-woo. And as the years have gone by and more serious psychologists have studied mindfulness, and as there's been a greater focus on how we can intentionally settle the mind, how we can focus attention, how we can let go of judgment and silence the internal pop-ups, which I'm going to talk about here in just a minute. And all of it is about developing a discipline around mindfulness, which has intention to be very focused on the moment. And we're not necessarily talking about long periods of time. It appears that even short periods of mindful focus on the now, on the present, has a serious positive outcome. Having a pause where individuals clarify their intention or meta-think a situation where they've allowed themselves to turn off internal distracting messages. All of these methods have consistently been shown to improve concentration and focus and actually improve internal hormonal regulation, which impacts stress levels inside the body. If we were to boil it down to some of the tactics that people use that we know are pretty effective to help establish a more mindful and relaxed state, we would pay attention to sleep. So we know that not only length of sleep, but quality of sleep is vital. It is in the third period of deep REM sleep where the brain seems to do its most effective cleansing. While the first 90-minute cycle is important, of course, and the second is important, the third is apparently spectacularly important because the brain turns on its own internal shower to help clean out residue, which, if it hangs around, does not do good things for us. A mini vacation is literally having a place where you have pictures of your favorite places, favorite people, favorite experiences. And what's interesting is that the mini vacation only has to be 3 or 4 minutes, where you pull out a picture, you pull up a particular image that's very it's a good cue to a very pleasant experience that you've had. And it has an impact on the body. The brain triggers certain hormones that reduces the stress hormones, which reduces cortisol, which has an ongoing impact throughout the day. So a mini vacation taken at least once a day, especially in the afternoon, has all kinds of residual benefits. We know getting people to walk is important because of the way our body has to shift cell debris. It can only be done through the lymph system, and that system works only by moving muscles. It's the reason why standing up and walking multiple times in a day helps reduce your body's physical sense of burnout. And of course, there's certain kinds of music which puts us in a relaxing mood. Choosing that piece of music, that song, that enables you to sit back and relax and imagine a pleasant place are all good tactics to help us restore and renew our brains. Now, our brains are a supercomputer, and all kinds of things are happening. And that supercomputer has so many programs running, some of whom those programs are working for all kinds of reasons that we no longer need today. Nonetheless, those programs are there, and I call them energy vampires. They're things that we need to work on decreasing, because the more we have them, the less we are able to have the kind of focus and concentration that we want to have. And certainly the more of these we have, the more burnout experiences we're going to have. So just as a quick drive-by, worldwide worthless worries, where we are concerned about how the whole world is going, getting in the way and distracting us. Also, task unrelated thoughts. These pop-ups happen 50 to 60,000 times a day that are constantly throwing us off our focus. There are unrealistic, unverified, fearful reactions to things where we find ourselves alarmed by something with insufficient realization of what the data is. And then, of course, automatic negative thoughts, which all of us have. As these are operating and we don't bring control to them, we don't, in essence, acknowledge them and tell them to be quiet, so to speak, we wind up consuming lots of brain energy and brain capacity, which reduces the energy and capacity we have to take care of the things we need to do to be as effective and satisfied as we'd like to be in our work. So we know burnout is a serious business and it's costly. We know that being brain savvy, just like we talked about, is really helpful. And we know, in fact, that everybody's different and has a range of different needs and different levels of intensity, which is why when we approach this from a talent management perspective, it's important to think about what is available to us. And in the case of the materials that Bob Eichinger and I have created, what's available to us to help individuals, managers, or leaders create the kind of culture and the environment that can reduce burnout and elevate the energies and motivations of people to achieve great things. If you've looked at our libraries, you know that we have 9 roles in CASAL, 11 in CASAM, and 10 in CASI. And those, each of those libraries have a different number of practices, and the practices vary across the different levels of organizational life. I've put in gold those particular roles that, when effectively fulfilled, reduce stress, reduce burnout, and enable individuals to feel productive and satisfied in their work. So with individual contributors, we know that helping them work smoothly with others and helping them around communicating and obviously getting feedback in that communication in a timely manner and making sure that we give them opportunities for personal growth and development really matters in them being able to manage the levels of stress that they have. And when we do these things, and we know that we're doing these things to encourage this for them, we know that they will, in fact, have more renewal and less burnout in the work that they do. Now, if we're in a managerial role, where we're working with those individual contributors and working with peers, and there's, in fact, more we can do. All of the highlighted roles in gold impact the culture and environment that have to do with the stressors created for those around us. So, for example, in producing results, while that's extremely important as a manager and a supervisor to make sure that's happening, how I help people prioritize and sequence and plan to produce those results is a really big deal. So it's not just producing results to get at particular outcomes, it's the ways in which we produce results that enable us to get to a better work environment. If you remember back in the research of collecting data where people were saying that, gee, too much is expected, it's too uncertain what my role is, and I don't know what the plan is, by focusing on producing results in a constructive, meaningful way, we help reduce those sources of burnout. Likewise, the way in which we build teams and help teams be effective, sharing the load so that there is not an uneven distribution of work. The ways in which people are encouraged to network and collaborate with one another, and when managers are focused on managing talent, they're paying attention to the capabilities and the assignment of tasks and responsibilities and the ways in which they're encouraging people to grow and develop. Now, managers who are mindful of their own needs and their own renewal and their own development and own energy levels are being a good role model for everyone else, and that's very important for them to do, as well as they show the kind of support for change that occurs, which we know change and transformation can create, and transition can create lots of sources of stress, if not, in fact, led well, which we do by aspiring and inspiring with others, inspiring others to do the work in meaningful, productive, and satisfying ways. And often, we may have to demonstrate that we can gain and apply perspective to the challenges that people are facing in order to make sure that the demands aren't too great. If you're in the leadership side of the house, where you have a great deal of responsibility for the culture and how things are structured and resources distributed, you are impacting the burnout levels of the organization. So making sure that one is attentive to those in very purposeful ways becomes particularly important. And of course, we know the way in which conflict is managed in an organization is hugely important to making sure that the organization is using conflict for productive purposes. Now, Talent Management Futures is in fact one of those responsibilities of those at the top of the house, which often gets short thrift when it comes to the distribution of effort. And yet it may be the single most important contribution to the long-term sustainability of the organization. So when I help leaders pay attention to this, it's also paying attention to the overall way in which the culture, the structure, the resources are being applied to help people be successful in their work. And I find that with any of these, whenever we are helping either individual contributors, managers, or leaders get clarity about how their roles impact the environment, they pay attention to that. They understand that that's true, and they can begin to see how their attention to these issues can help us deal with the stress levels inside of an organization. Now, as you know, we have practices within each of the libraries, and while not obviously all of these practices become a part of the personal curriculum to deal with stress, one of the things I think is really important is to help individuals identify which practice is going to have the biggest payoff now in this certain environment, in this particular context. So for example, it could well be that developing resilience for individual contributors in a particular environment would be the most important practice. It could well be that helping them understand how to collaborate with others would be the greatest source of renewal and reduction of stress levels in the organization. My point being, we know these practices that I have listed impact the burnout and stress levels in the organization. We also know they're not all equally important at all times. And one of the beauties of the system that we have created is helping individuals identify and prioritize what's going to give me the biggest return, given where I am in the organization and where the organization is. Likewise, from a managerial perspective, thinking about what are the things that I may have to do as a manager to keep my own self in a renewable dynamic, as well as making sure that the things I'm doing as a manager are encouraging people to find sources of renewal in their day-to-day lives. And maybe that means the way I create work structures. Maybe that has to do with the way I'm communicating with others. I'll need to figure that out and prioritize. And of course, 360 surveys give us a good handle on which of these we're doing sufficiently and which we're not. And if I'm a manager and I do care about the capability of my workforce, and I find out that in a survey that I'm not being attentive to creating an engaging mood, or I'm not being attentive to the level of communication they need, then I know that I'm impacting the stress levels of the work unit. And of course, the same thing at the leadership level. What are the things that as a leader I might be doing to enhance my own effectiveness, as well as helping the culture be in a place where the culture is fostering the kind of environment that promotes overall well-being. So we would say that thank goodness, as we have created these libraries and we've looked at these serious performance issues and the dynamic that we are all in today, in this VUCA world, that we need to move from volatility to vision, that we need to move from uncertainty to understanding, that we need to shift from complexity to caring in our attention as leaders and managers, as well as employees, and that we need to find how to be agile to deal with the fluid and ambiguous demands that are coming at us. So we would say the particular behaviors associated with these practices will help us get there. Now, you know that we have both card and virtual sorting methodologies to help individuals and teams to get a handle on what they're doing or what they see as important. You know that our 360 surveys help gather data for analysis, and our support materials, DIY, develop it yourself, give the kind of action tips to move toward a fix. We think that the mindfulness practices, for example, are going to be vital as we move forward, and we would say that those are very important things to get to know more about and develop. All of our material, I believe, cuts through Kagan's levels of meaning making. I've yet to have a level 2 or a level 5 reject the card sort, whether it's a physical card sort or now virtual. I have found that when people are thinking about, especially what's the kind of environment that I want to create, paying attention to the roles and practices that we've identified really matters. And then, of course, zeroing in by using our analytical tools to help people zero in on what's going to matter, what's going to be most important, is what you get by working with our placemats. So it's my view that if, in fact, we come back to paying attention to these roles at each level of organizational life, if our primary focus is helping an organization and individuals in that organization find sources of renewal and reduce the levels of burnout inside of the organization, and paying attention to these roles and these practices will be our absolute best strategies to do so.